Welcome to a new term. During this first module of verbal behavior, we actually won't be explicitly covering verbal behavior itself. Instead, we'll start out discussing some prerequisites that are important for a learner to master before moving on to acquisition of a verbal repertoire. Every module of this course includes some specific learning objectives. These are what you'll be tested on in comprehension checks throughout the term, as well as the final exam. Many objectives will also be relevant to your application papers. We'll formally define verbal behavior in the next module, but to start out, it's important to note that verbal behavior is subject to the same principles as nonverbal behavior, including reinforcement, extinction, punishment, stimulus control, etc. Verbal behavior can be taught in accordance with all of the behavior analytic approaches that you've learned about in this program thus far. So ultimately, verbal behavior is just learned behavior like any other operant behavior, though there are some unique aspects to it that we'll discuss later in the term. The important thing is that we should not expect verbal behavior to simply emerge without training at a certain age or developmental stage. This may appear to happen in the case of typically developing children, since they share similar phylogenetic predispositions and verbal communities overall. However, the same principles of learning are at work in those cases. They simply happen naturally in day-to-day life, rather than being deliberately therapeutically programmed. When working with individuals with language delays, we use the same naturally occurring contingencies, deliberately arranged to be consistent and intensive. Before moving on to talk about what behaviors might be necessary for a learner to master before moving on to language acquisition, I do want to pause to consider why it's so important to focus on verbal behavior in the first place, particularly if it's ultimately pretty much the same as nonverbal behavior. Firstly, communication is a cusp behavior. What is a cusp? Verbal behavior allows the learner to access a wide variety of reinforcers with lower response effort and a low likelihood of punishment, as it's typically deemed an appropriate behavior across settings. This is something we'll ponder throughout this term and beyond, but by most behavior analytic definitions, verbal behavior appears to be unique to humans. Non-human animals don't seem to engage in verbal behavior, or at the very least not to the extent that humans do. Why is that? It's an important question to consider, as it might help us in determining exactly what the prerequisites to verbal behavior are, such that we can teach those prerequisites to people who struggle with engaging in verbal behavior. Verbal behavior is extremely complex, since it typically involves back and forth interactions between multiple organisms. One speaker's behavior produces auditory stimuli, which in turn affects the second speaker's behavior, and that person's behavior then proceeds to affect the first speaker's behavior. When you think about it, it's pretty incredible that these verbal episodes are self-sustaining in this way without the necessity of environmental input outside of the conversation. With that being said, it's important that we're able to demonstrate as behavior analysts that our science does in fact still extend to something as complex as verbal behavior, and confirm our assumption that our principles are thoroughgoing. Now let's move on to some prerequisites of verbal behavior. You've covered much of this in previous courses in this program, so this is going to be a fairly straightforward review. With that being said, if you'd like to refresh yourself in more depth, all of this information is coming from chapters 1, 3, and 4 of Derived Relational Responding, Applications for Learners with Autism and Other Developmental Disabilities. Just as a learner must be able to grasp an object before they can be taught to eat with a fork, there are many behaviors that one must master before a complex verbal repertoire can be established. These include learner readiness skills, such as sitting appropriately in a chair, attending to an instructor and instructional materials, and imitating simple responses, as well as other behaviors such as identity matching to sample and matching stimuli across sense modes. These all in turn can lead to more complex repertoires of joint attention and social referencing. We'll discuss each of these one by one in this module. But first things first, before attempting to establish any kind of repertoire, we must first ensure that we have access to effective reinforcers. All behavior is under the control of the consequences that have followed it in the past, and if a consequence isn't reinforcing, the behavior is not likely to continue to occur. Again, this will just be a quick review. The paired stimulus preference assessment is typically considered to be the gold standard of identifying stimuli that are likely to be reinforcers. But the downside is that it takes a significant amount of time. The multiple stimulus without replacement assessment was developed in order to address this concern. But the limitation here is that the percentage of opportunities out of which a stimulus was selected can't be used to correlate to likely reinforcing effectiveness. While the paired stimulus preference assessment produces a hierarchy of relative preference, in the MSWO, if an item is consistently picked second, that means that it has been picked 1 out of 2 times that it's been presented, 50%. This suggests that it's half as effective as the item picked first, but that's often simply not true. Ultimately, this just means that most of the time, the items picked first, second, or third in the MSWO are likely to work as reinforcers. So with those pros and cons in mind, how should you go about assessing preference? Typically, a paired choice preference assessment is conducted when you first begin working with a new client, and then periodically, perhaps every few months, while working with them. An MSWO can and should be run multiple times per day, whenever a new session begins or if you observe that accuracy or attentiveness is decreasing. This could be a sign of declining motivation. Other tips include separating out your assessments of edible versus non-edible stimuli and ensuring that the learner actually gets brief access to what they choose contingent upon selecting it. One more key point to keep in mind when it comes to reinforcement is that ultimately, social interaction must function as reinforcement if complex verbal repertoires are to develop. It's important for a learner to be able to ask for what they want. In that case, the verbal behavior is typically reinforced by a nonverbal stimulus. But most clients, caregivers, and communities also want the learner to engage in conversation. For that matter, listening to others' voices is also typically a necessary part of learning new skills. So those voices, in and of themselves, must become conditioned reinforcement. This often does not happen automatically for learners with developmental disabilities. As such, in those cases, you would need to actively and intensively pair social interaction with existing, powerful forms of reinforcement. One more quick review before we get into establishment of specific prerequisite behaviors. When it comes down to basic, these skills can be taught with procedures consisting of shaping and prompting. So here's a quiz. What is differential reinforcement? And what is shaping? When it comes to prompting, what are response prompts? And what are stimulus prompts? While there are certainly many valid arguments for allowing a learner to engage in other topographies of behavior during lessons, ultimately, sitting in a chair is going to be an expectation of students in most academic settings, and many workplaces as well. In addition, roaming about the room can provide access to a variety of stimuli that may distract from presentation of instructional materials. Not to mention the fact that it's difficult to quickly present those instructional materials unless you have access to a flat surface that your learner is near. When teaching this behavior, the basic procedure is simply to physically prompt the learner into the chair and provide differential reinforcement for progressively longer periods of time spent sitting in the chair. Note, however, that physical prompts can be aversive, evoking any kind of disruptive behavior that has led to escape from the aversive situations in the past. In those cases, one option would be to gradually introduce physical contact, differentially reinforcing longer durations of tolerance of that contact. Since this is a relatively low response effort behavior with a simple teaching procedure, it's a great early opportunity to establish instructional control by pairing yourself with contingent reinforcement. Now let's consider eye contact. First, keep in mind that we wouldn't really expect a 3 or 4-year-old to make eye contact for a prolonged period of time every single time someone said their name. There's no need for something so contrived to be your goal. Instead, you can teach appropriate attending as part of your other instructional programs. Typical procedures include a time delay, waiting for a moment to allow the opportunity for independent responding before providing a prompt. You could also initially keep instructional materials near your face, if you wish for the learner to attend to both variables. If necessary, you can provide light physical guidance of the learner's face toward the relevant materials. When it comes to reinforcement, I'll quote directly from the text on page 19. When the student gives appropriate eye contact, they're presented with an opportunity to respond to a direction, and then reinforcement is provided contingent on responding correctly to the direction. Thus, eye contact is conceptualized as a necessary part of the instructional sequence. In other words, there is often no need for us to establish the behavior of making eye contact in and of itself. It's almost always simply a necessary part of other types of social interactions. With that being said, you should also always reinforce spontaneous eye contact throughout the day. As noted previously, vocalization and social interactions sometimes do not naturally become conditioned reinforcers for individuals with developmental disabilities. Similarly, attention to instructional materials like flashcards and manipulables might not be a pre-existing part of their repertoire when they begin working with you. As with establishing any conditioned reinforcer, the next step here is simply to pair the instructional materials with existing forms of reinforcement. Generalized imitation is a hugely important skill to establish. We often use model prompts when teaching more complex motor and vocal behaviors, and unless the learner has mastered this skill, that's simply not going to work. Note that generalized imitation involves reliable copying of novel behaviors without specific training. When establishing this repertoire, you should begin with prompting and reinforcement of basic one-step behaviors, such as tapping the table or stacking a block on top of another. Then, you could move on to multi-step responses, such as standing up and then sitting back down, or pouring water and then drinking it. Interestingly, there's some evidence that imitation of actions involving objects, rather than just one's own body, can be easier to acquire, so this may be a good place to start. When using objects, be sure to have more than just the object that you want to use on the table so that the model becomes the SD and not just the object itself. Another suggestion is to begin with actions that the learner can observe themselves doing. For example, they can see their own hands clapping, but can't see their hand tapping their own head. One way around this is to have the learner observe themselves engaging in the action while looking in the mirror. Note that generalization between vocal and non-vocal imitative repertoires should not be unequivocally expected. That is, you'll likely need to target these two skills separately. With that being said, non-vocal imitation is easier to start with, as you can't physically prompt vocal behavior. A major prerequisite to relational responding, a key part to any complex verbal repertoire, is matching. When a novel stimulus is matched to itself without any training, that is a demonstration of reflexivity. Another form of matching involves the same stimulus but experienced in different sense modes. For example, hearing a dog bark and then pointing to a picture of a dog in an array of stimuli. We'll get more into detail regarding the many instructional possibilities when it comes to that, but to start out, it's important to note that this basic skill is being demonstrated when, for example, the learner looks toward the person who says their name. The sound of the person's voice has been matched to the person making that sound. There are protocols for establishing this repertoire in Chapter 3 of Derived Relational Responding. All forms of matching require conditional discrimination. In a simple discrimination, an SD is presented, occasioning a response which is then reinforced. For example, every time an apple is presented, the learner points at it, and that is praised. Simple discriminations are quite rare in everyday life. Responding is almost always under the control of a conditional stimulus. For example, in the case of identity matching to sample, pointing to the apple would only be reinforced if the conditional SD, the sample stimulus, was also an apple. To establish this repertoire, you may first need to establish the behavior of the learner pointing to or picking up instructional materials in general. Then, you would want to teach them to pick up or point to a specific stimulus only when a copy of that stimulus is presented. Finally, as with the case of generalized imitation, you would want to test to ensure that generalized identity matching has emerged with novel stimuli. Many of the prerequisite skills discussed in this module include some degree of joint attention, coordination of eye contact and other behaviors like pointing that occasions the behavior of multiple people interacting with the same stimulus. Some signs of this are the learner shifting their gaze between the stimulus and other people in the room, or engaging in behaviors like pointing maintained specifically by getting the attention of the other person. Joint attention seems to require some of the prerequisites we've already been talking about, including attending to speech sounds of others and social interactions, acting as conditioned reinforcement. Social referencing is a similar concept with some slight differences. It's based more on the learner reacting to a stimulus in the same way as another person, rather than simply attending to it. These are fairly complex repertoires, much more so than some of the other prerequisites we've talked about in this module, but it's easy to see how they would be an integral part of a highly developed verbal repertoire. As such, we'll quickly review some procedures for building toward these skills. First, as discussed previously, it's important for social interactions to be reinforcing. This can be accomplished through pairing, but you can also use slightly different procedures to establish these social interactions as SDs. For example, you could allow the learner to access some form of reinforcement, like a cookie, only when you smile and nod. Attempting to access the cookie prior to that would be blocked or prevented in some way. Another step is to teach the learner to look at the same stimuli you're looking at. Again, the goal is for your behavior to affect the behavior of the learner. This can be achieved by using fading techniques. For example, two boxes are presented and one has a reinforcer inside. You could begin by moving such that your face is very near to the box with the reinforcer while you're looking at it. If the learner opens that box, the behavior will be reinforced. You can probably see that this is another form of conditional discrimination. Then, in subsequent trials, you would gradually move your face further away, requiring the learner to look at you in order to gain access to the conditional discriminative stimulus of your gaze. That's it for this week. Be sure to review the syllabus regarding upcoming assignments and required textbooks. For this course, both textbooks can be accessed online. Even if you prefer physical copies, if you haven't received them yet, you can complete the assigned reading with the ebooks.